become purer over time because in and of itself, art is just generating abstraction for the sake of generating abstraction, right? It's just abstraction for the sake of the abstract, to be more simplistic about it.
Oh,
So,
that's a great
but
topic, by
isn't
the way.
classical music? Yeah, I mean, classical music is another example. It's hundreds of years old. It should be dying out, essentially, but no, it's not. And then people are still, instead of using a synthesizer, you use a violin, use these physical classical instruments, right? You actually know how to use them, and it's impressive. But it also sounds beautiful. I mean, you look at, I mean, you just listen, just listen to it. It's even better in the live performance. And just normal audio source doesn't ring true at all. You have to actually be there. You actually feel the music. It's the most beautiful thing you'll ever experience in your life. For myself personally, the first time I experienced something like that, I literally cried. So I think something like that is definitely an indicator for that art itself on that level will not die out. It just will die out in an industrial sense, right? So that's what I meant. So if you want to do industrial art, you have to make sure that you get with the times, which is get with the industry that is then making sure that the AI, which will be distributing your content, which will be adding utility to your content through someone else's ideas, is the thing that you license yourself to, such that you get your rightful gains for the information, the abstraction that you created. Right? That's the point I made.
Well, there is a reason why
Yeah,
Stradivari violin cost $20 million.
Flawed in here.
Bingo.
marketing.
Could be wrong. Oh no, there it is.
Sorry.
Metaphor. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Here we go.
So I was actually going to ask Adrian.
On it.
Yeah, I agree that the marketing thing was pretty funny. But you touched on a topic while you were talking. You're trying to define art. I'm curious if you have a definition for what is art.
Yeah, basically, art in and of itself as a concept is just purely generating like abstraction for the sake of the abstract. But it's a universally scalable thing itself because of it being a concept. Think about being able to say,
Show how stretchy.
imagine a cook. Let's imagine a cook for a second. They're able to chop up a vegetable faster than anyone else. Sure, the robot could do this more effectively, or the machine, the blender, whatever you have, could do this more effectively, but it's still massively impressive if the human does it, right? So the same thing also applies to video games. The same thing also applies to anything else, or even painting, or you do something weird, something completely abstract. Like, hey, I'm going to paint on the side of, I'm going to put some art on the side of a wall somewhere by essentially just burning a piece of timber and then rubbing it on the wall in such a way that it ends up to be like a dragon or something. That I think is art, right? You take something that is exceedingly abstract and you generate abstraction for the sake of the abstract, right?
I'm going to pose a different definition if you're open to it.
Definitely.
Okay, so what if art is kind of like the movie Inception, but
Alright, hold on.
art is
I'm
when
gonna show
you're
how
when a
stretchy this
human
stuff
is able to incept
I've already
an
squeezed
emotion
it.
or an experience or some kind of story into another human's mind
It's very
through
much like
some
a
form
rubber
of
band.
medium. Whether that's like cooking something so they reach back into like their childhood or like there's nostalgia. That's why like somebody might like a chef that cooks the kind of food that reminds them of their home cooking, while someone else might not. Someone
no,
might
there
like
it is.
spices because it's like a dance in their mouth. Whatever that might be. Same thing for like when you're listening to music
Pulling it.
or like say like Saving Private Ryan. Most of us have not been to war, but we can relate to this. Oh my God, it's the last son of the family. They must save him, and it gives you this emotional roller coaster, right? Like we know we're watching a movie, and our body still goes through the whole thing. So I think maybe this inception, and this I guess goes to the argument of like what is good art, but
Hey, bro.
the reason why I bring this up is because if that is the correct definition of art, or if a definition of art,
Alright, hold on.
then
I'm gonna show
no
how stretchy
AI
this
could
stuff
ever
is.
replace humans
I've already
because
squeezed it.
we want to relate with other humans, and that is the whole point. And in fact, we often want to relate with a specific human. That's why people like to go to a Taylor Swift concert. Not somebody else could be a really good Taylor Swift impersonator. They don't necessarily want to go to that. Although there is a country, I think Japan, where there is a Taylor Swift impersonator. I forget what country it was. There was one country that was doing it because she wasn't going there. And then when she went there, everybody went to her concert, not the impersonator's concert. So it's this thing that we want to connect to the human on the other end, not the AI.
I love that actually. What if, okay, so I'm gonna posit something here at the same time because that's actually fundamentally true. What if, say, the generation of abstraction for the sake of the abstract is true from a production sense, the effect, the intent is what gives it its value, its life, essentially.
Well, and
Think about
Yeah, I
it.
think you described the
Humans
medium.
generate the inceptive element,
Stretchy this stuff
right?
is.
Yeah, you described what
I've already
makes for a good
squeezed it.
medium for art, and I was trying to
Yes.
describe what makes for good art in experience, at
It's
least.
very much like a
I
rubber
think both
band.
would be kind of the same because one needs to be it needs to be manufactured, and the same it also has to have some sort of inceptive idea attached to it, right? So I think if I were to say, for instance, post out there saying, generate art, the purest definition of art is essentially, from a production perspective, generating abstraction for the sake of the abstract, you could potentially quote post that and say, yes, but only if the human is the element that incepts feeling to you through that medium, right? Because
Right.
I think that's the last 20% that you need to map for somehow. That's something that AI lacks, and that's, I think, is the creativity element, right? It's to engineer concepts in such a way that generates this beautiful feeling or whatever. Right? Like I generate art from an AI, then it's still just AI stuff, but the way that the AI has configured the stuff is still in accordance to my idea, and I put this out with a certain context, like say a text, and it generates an emotive response, right? So I think that's what you're kind of the emotive response is what you're trying to hit on, correct?
Yeah. You got it. You're ahead of the class. I was going to ask you two more questions in this thought experiment. So you're nailing the next
Go ahead,
question,
go
which
ahead.
is, what happens if humans,
Oh no,
like
there it is.
AI generated content, some are going to start to argue is not art. Yet, if a human is the one sitting there refining it, kind of like Scott's friend who was trying to make a beer, it wasn't quite right. They keep tweaking it, and they can't quite get where they want, and they finally get there. And then everybody's been doing stuff, and somebody comes up with a very unique, imaginative idea. It's no different than if somehow magically everybody was really good at making movies, and everybody had crazy budgets,
Hey, bro.
and everybody was really good at painting. That just because everybody's got the ability to write stories and paint and draw and make movies doesn't mean that everybody's going to become Martin Scorsese, right? There is a reason why even all the people out there who have all the resources and they're billionaires, they can't necessarily just make those masterpieces, because it's not the ability to make it that's limiting them. It's the creativity and the whatever it is. And on the flip side, I would say things like, an Eminem, who's a rapper, it's his personal life story that attracts you to it. So here's the second part of the thought experiment. Or actually, I'll let Wiggles go, and I'll ask you the second part of the experiment.
No, just wanted to add that in today's world, everybody can make music. Like everybody has a computer, everybody has virtual instruments. Everybody can get like a cheap Ableton DAW or something like that, and only few make it like to the very top through self-publishing, through through mastering, through composing, and all those traits and skills that it takes to create a world recognized hit. So yeah, it's like everybody has that opportunity today, but only few really make it.
I think we're missing something important here. We're dancing around that a lot of art isn't made to be commercial. It's not like the motivation behind it is not to be the best in the world at something. It's just the pure expression of self. Some people write, some people,
or to be heard.
Well, I mean, maybe
to convey your feeling, right?
That's like yes and, right? Because it's like a journal. Not everybody shares their art. They're talking to themselves first and foremost. And even this is even true of a lot of the best artists. They're not tap dancing for the audience. They're trying to express themselves. Wow. And some people take that commercial and it goes very, very well, and less well. And then some people just do it in the garage or in the shed with an easel, and that's it.
I'll be pedantic and say they're writing to their future self.
Sure, no, it's great.
Who is then like, so if you, for example, if you wrote in a journal and your future self couldn't understand your chicken scratch or what you wrote, I wouldn't call that good art, right? So we're putting a little spectrum on it.
Well, it depends on who you're trying to change, because if the person creating the art is doing it therapeutically, if the process was the therapeutic part, like how many times are they going to go back and read that journal? But writing it down when it happened, they've shown that writing can help to ground things better, like handwriting, not typing on a computer. Memories and
I
learning.
agree. I agree.
So as a like self-therapeutic technique, you're using that same hack on emotional processing.
Yeah, I would argue for the purposes of the thought experiment I was going to
Mm,
try, and you found an answer already. We'll call that like therapeutic art, and
cool.
we'll put that aside for a second. But I have a the wrench I wanted to throw
Hmm.
is if we agree on the definition and we agree that an AGI exists. Let's say that AGI eventually people are using it to like sit there and render and create a bunch of stuff, and it learns what humans now are conveying and liking and enjoying. What happens when the AI just is randomly generating content that evokes emotion?
Yeah. So this is where I
It depends, I think, on how effective it is. I mean, if you go to again, now you go to down to the example of food. Now, this implies something different. This implies context. And so if I were to think about it this way, I'd say if the AGI is clever enough, it would give you the context needed to understand the art or the stuff that it had manufactured to basically, because what is actually emotion and connection to an object? It's calling to some data that's in your brain, is it not? So if you were to think of it in those terms, you could manufacture the context and then you can call to
The
whatever it is
AI
that you
could
want at
manufacture,
will.
yeah, the AI could manufacture
Context.
a chef and a story behind the chef and tell you all about it
Yes.
and like where they went and
Yes.
like because if you ever go to one of those fine dining places, they bring out
Exactly.
a plate and they're like, these mushrooms came from this place and that, and they say all these
hmm
things like nobody's fact checking that. So in theory, I posit the question at that point: can the AI make art?
From that perspective, I would say so, yes. Because at the moment, we have a basic we have human manufactured context, right? We have context manufactured by the humans. If I were to say take a child, and this is actually really interesting, let's take a look at this from the perspective of the potential of humans. If I take a child and I treated them with little to no adversity, then that child would probably grow up to be very smart, be very annoying, very entitled. But if I were to say, put a child in an environment where there is a lot of adversity, this child would become the human when it grows up would become a lot more appreciative of the world, be very down to earth, would probably try to make other people smile, make people happy, that kind of thing, right? It would be a better version of human being essentially, right? And so if we took that exact same concept and were to apply it to say the education of a human to manufacture context to which we can call to with a object that we define as art, then I think that would work, would it not?
I'm using the Socratic method for now. I'll give my opinion at the end if that's okay.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah,
sure. I like it.
isn't the purpose of art to be both evocative and provocative? And in many cases, the best art comes from suffering and not
hmm
from having everything just so easy. And does the AI suffer? Does that's kind of part of the emotional connection. And I think going to another thing
I don't
that
know.
Meta was talking about is like how much is the beauty of the art versus the message of the art. So
hmm
the example I think is if we all know Gary Larson in the Far Side Gallery, he never considered himself to be a very good artist. He had difficulty drawing. And what made the Far Side Gallery so great was not his art, but was really the message and the joke he was trying to bring across. It was always brilliant. That's what everyone loved about that. And
hmm
so you can kind of say, yeah, do you need that? And then if you look, and again, another analogy is that AI basically is Bob Ross. I mean, the first time you saw Bob Ross doing it, it was like, by God, that's cheating. No way. I mean, that's how you can do a painting, you know? He's like, he would have all these tricks. He was taking like the fun out of watching a magic show in a way. And then he showed you what was going on. And then you have to begin to think, it's like, okay, is what Bob Ross is showing us, does that mean it's no longer art because he's using all these little tricks to create these beautiful scenes? Or does it come down to us being smart enough and creative enough to now know how to use those techniques to create wonderful art? So yeah, I can learn all the Bob Ross tricks, but I probably can't come up with a painting that's going to be as evocative as what he does because he's got that creative streak that I don't have when it comes to painting.
Hey, bro.
I'm sure you could make some happy little clouds if you wanted to.
Dude.
Yeah, but still, it's that's what it is. Now I can become a fantastic artist just by prompting Midjourney to do something. But then I kind of have to keep prompting it again and again because I might have to look into the piece and see that, whoa, wait a minute, that's distorted, that's not quite right. You've got to correct this piece, but at the same time, there's some message or something I'm trying to evoke and bring across. And that's what's important about the art, is making sure it comes across unfiltered and obvious, and not kind of lost in the art itself. Or sometimes you do want it to be hidden in the art. It's almost like a secret message you want to have buried in there for someone to have to look at very closely to figure out what it is, and then finally have that aha moment. Oh, I see what he was trying to tell me.
Yeah, besides context, back to metaphors, AI inquiry to trigger emotion, it would also need to understand the culture. Like the humor and memetics, none of the current GPTs can generate any memes successfully. It's typically just some extrapolation from the training set. So yeah, I think it's very meta, and I just don't see how it could understand deeply context together with culture to have humor nailed.
Exactly.
So the question here is, where does the notion of a human's idea come from? There's a great TED Talk called "When Ideas Have Sex."
I remember
the title
that
kind
one.
of teaches you everything about the concept.
That's good.
The concept that like maybe our neurons are remixing a bunch of things together and then pumping something out. That's kind of where maybe I would say a lot of humor and memes come from. Like the definition of humor, I love definitions, by the way, but like to me, the definition of humor is when something feels uncomfortable and then suddenly it's made to be safe. If a model learns that is how good humor is architectured, then it can learn that. It has learned about culture. Like Scott was saying, it could learn to evoke emotions, whether it be sad or like the Sistine Chapel, holy feelings, whatever it may be. What happens if, let's say, we start off with AI that's saving people's lives, and then we make its way to humans are using it to make really good art, and now it can make better art than humans can, and nobody wants to consume any other human's art as a result. What happens in that?
We're really going to have to understand sense of purpose, and ideally recraft our entire civilization around inspiring people to have a sense of purpose with some sense of like civic duty, so that we're always making sure that all the bases are covered.
It's very much like a rubber band.
Metaphor, have you ever seen generative art through code?
Have I ever seen generative art through code? What do you mean?
Yes. Essentially just say, well, taking random pieces of information, or it's like some sort of numbers, and inputting them into a system, and out pops something that is generative. Let's say, for instance, I'm animating something, let's say a bunch of okay, let's make it actually more simple. Let's imagine that it is smoke within a box that it's rendered in P5.js in some way. You figured out how to do this. You figured out how to essentially have these particles float around in 3D space. And essentially, you put a random number into it, which could be associated with whatever, really, say your birthday. And then all of a sudden, it generates a different type of smoke cloud that behaves a little differently. Have you ever seen something like this before? Would you agree that that is art?
Yeah. What you're describing is very akin to when we project our minds onto clouds and we see art through the randomness. Is that what you're referring to?
Something like that. Essentially, where I'm saying that you can use technology, and you could use technology to generate really cool art. And this actually, you'd have to look into generative art. I've actually owned some generative art. Like I have a piece that essentially, well, it lives on the blockchain. Well, this is something that you probably won't like, but essentially takes an address and just uses these numbers to randomize a bunch of effects, and then it just basically infinitely keeps rendering, and you could just leave it open as a window, and it would infinitely give you random patterns forever, right? But it's only generated randomly off of your address number the entire time. Wouldn't that be just? Isn't that also art?
Is this a lava lamp?
Something like that. Think about it as a digital. Okay, that's actually a really good way to explain it. It's a digital lava lamp that lives on the blockchain. Its appearance essentially defined by the address it belongs to.
Yeah, I think
Like
what
that.
happens in my mind, and this obviously this is a subjective opinion here,
I think I
but
chose a
like
terrible example.
I was gonna say, like Scott said, it's more
Oh
of
no, there
the
it is.
it's the equivalent of like when somebody says a tree is art. To me, I would use that as like it's awe-inspiring maybe,
Found it.
but it's a different emotion than I feel connected to another human through a medium.
It's kind of like the difference between
That's very
doing
nice.
and
See, again,
being.
you called on context, right?
Sorry,
Is this a
yeah.
Oh, okay. So when I go in the forest and I look at a tree, it's absolutely beautiful and it evokes all sorts of emotions and beauty and stuff like that. It's not art. But then I go home
I'm not sure how
and someone
stretchy
has
this stuff
painted
is.
that tree for me.
I've already squeezed
Suddenly
it.
now that painting has a very different meaning.
It's very much
it
like a
it
rubber
brings those
band.
emotions back. So it's rather odd. We're both talking about the same object, and when I'm staring at the real object, I have a completely different sense
Saw it
versus,
in here.
as Meta says, awe,
Could be wrong.
versus the fact that someone was
Oh,
able
no,
to
there it
capture
is.
that for me, and now it has a sense of permanence and can carry forward.
Pulling it.
But this,
Well, I would argue what you're feeling when you're looking at the painting is you're seeing the tree through their eyes and you're experiencing it through their eyes because of what they chose to attend to when they were looking at the tree might be different than what you were attending to, and the way the clouds and the lighting and all that looked at that moment. So I think it's that it
Hey, bro.
in a weird way. I'm just going to describe it as like I think it's like looking at art should evoke some
Alright,
kind of
hold on. I'm
oxytocin
not sure
release.
how stretchy
And
this stuff
I mean
is.
that in like the sense that you're feeling like you're being
I've already
hugged or touched
squeezed
by
it.
another human and a connection to another human. And when that is not there, it doesn't
It's
happen. And
very
so
much
in
like a rubber
my
band.
like possibly very biased interpretation, my assumption is that once you know at some level it was generated by AI, just like all the Sora images, if a human had generated a lot of those, we probably would have
there
been
it is.
feeling like, oh wow, tell me more about what inspired this. But we haven't gotten to the point where we're like, tell me what inspired that prompt, because we don't feel like there was inspiration to these prompts other than to just like randomly try and generate something interesting. So I think when we feel connected to good art, what we're feeling is a sense of oxytocin and connection to another human, and being social beings, that's what we crave. Short of like Neuralink or something in your brain just like triggering oxytocin happening, my assumption is like if we just talk about AI, not like
Alright, hold on. I'm not sure how
metaphysics,
stretchy this
sorry,
stuff
not
is.
like virtual reality
I've already
or
squeezed it.
injection into the brain directly. That's the claim I'm trying to make for now.
yeah, but you also have, I
It's
guess
very
you,
much
Okay.
you
like a
could say the
rubber
different
band.
senses that you get, that before there was photography, the role of an artist was basically to record everything faithfully.
Saw it in here.
So they would do a portrait and everything else.
Could be
And when you
wrong.
look at the portrait,
Oh no,
you
there
were
it
just
is.
impressed with the skill level of the artist to be able to so accurately depict what was reality. And then when photography
People
was
make
invented, that was, the artists were put out of business, right? There was like no reason to do that anymore. And then you get French Impressionism. And suddenly it changed. And then when you look at art, French Impressionist art, I get a very different sense than when I look at the Dutch masters. It's just, and that's sort of how art has evolved. And I guess our expectations and our emotional connections, it's no longer, oh, that person was very faithful in being able to record what they saw. This person is now able to see things that I didn't see before. Basically, like what you're saying, their point of view, and their point of view now is much more rich than it was before. Because before there was no
I would
creativity,
say
it was pure copying, recording what they were seeing, and that was it.
I disagree with that claim because I think a lot of the original art pieces were like of deities, imagined scenes, universes, or
Wildlife.
like
Yeah, but
cyclopses and things like that.
go look at the Dutch masters. It's okay. I agree. You have a lot of the other stuff, which was like, trying to record scenes that weren't there. But then you have the others who were the artists that it seemed like they were just trying to be photographers with paintbrushes.
Hey, bro.
And And the
Wow.
photographers who were just, or sorry, the people who were just trying to be photographers, I would imagine a lot of them went out of business because they weren't conveying an emotion anymore that was more emotive
Yeah.
than looking at a photograph. And yet those who, like, you know, say you look at a photographer and they really capture the essence of a person, and there's another photographer who just like gets a still photo. There's still a reason why we have a more emotive response to certain pieces versus others.
Yeah, but you know, some of it might be recording, like you say, all these different deities and everything. But there's something still very realistic about the images, even though we know they're kind of concocted. They still, the angels look real. They look like people, and the wings look like wings, and everything about the scene looks like. Anymore. Suddenly there's motion in there, and there's blurriness, and there's all these other different senses. There's pointillism. There's everything else that they're starting to experiment with, and then you start, you know, moving on into more modern art, Cubism. That showed a transformation, that there was a different way of viewing the world that was far more creative than someone imagining a particular famous scene, you know, of Napoleon winning some famous battle that was never recorded, or George Washington crossing the Delaware, right? You know, it's like everything about that image looks like it could have actually been historically accurate, even though we know it wasn't historically accurate. But everything about it, the proportions and everything, was exactly what you would expect.
Yeah, the way you can also think about this is, back then humans were struggling to survive, and so they were having really bad sex with their ideas. And as people's, like, you know, needs went down, or their survival instincts were being taken care of more, their ideas were having better sex. Like, they had more time to think, they had more time to plan, and that kind of stuff. Just think of it like that. And you could also think of it like, if too many people are doing the same thing, that particular form of idea sex gets boring. You gotta switch it up.
Actually, that's a really good point. This is also the reason why there's some people don't see distribution of the algorithm, because everything that they do is so.
Oh no, there it is.
We can't hear you.
You're
Particularly just to. Is this better?
Yeah, this now. I can hear you.
Is it still coming across like shit?
No, I can hear you now, bud.
Is it better? Is it working now? Yeah, I got shit internet. I'm gonna have to talk to the guys who. Yeah, I have to talk to the guys who are providing this and give them a time of their lives. And if they don't, I'm gonna break into their systems and fix it myself. But okay, I'm not kidding. I did it before, and they actually made more money because of that. Anyways, yeah. So, yeah. I'm gonna make you my bitch if you don't. So, okay, to bring it back to essentially the definition of art itself. What if we unify the two concepts of what we created here, and we just say that art derives from provocation, a call to your experiences? What do you think? Is that a good definition for art as a concept?
I'm going to claim that it doesn't have to be limited to your experiences, because when I watch Saving Private Ryan, I guess it is calling to some experiences in that I have a mother or a family. So, you know what?
There may even
Maybe.
be genetic.
I'm going to play with it a little
There may
bit.
even be genetic memory we don't understand yet.
Yeah, but I mean, death is a very well understood thing. I think if a child were to watch this, okay, you obviously don't do this, but imagine if a child were to watch Saving Private Ryan, they would only be emotionally touched by certain elements, like, say, for instance, a person crying, because that's very relatable. But as you get older, you start to learn more concepts, and thereby I think you have more experiences necessarily that then allow you to kind of understand what this is. Because I mean, you will always experience, say, tragedy in a similar fashion. You don't have to learn how to experience tragedy. It just happens. The way that you are is the way that you then tend to process it. And that's why I say certain movies hit at you, because there's this deeply natural thing about you that at some point you reach this point where you experience tragedy, and then your brain somehow has to parse that, somehow has to parse something out of the dissonance, right? Like, hey, this person's gone, and we have the rest of the future, and the distance between the two is the dissonance that you then have to try and manufacture and subsequently parse, right?
I think you've refined it very well. Thank you. By the way, I've had this conversation with many people, and it's never been refined. So I really appreciate these conversations.
Cool. I'm gonna post that. Why not?
The particular thing that comes to mind for me is the child example for Saving Private Ryan is really good. But imagine if you went to like an island of people who have never left a particular island, they always live there, and you showed them Friends. They'd be very confused as to what the heck they're watching, even if the language barrier
Yes.
wasn't a thing. So it's kind of like the whole. I don't think this is true, by the way, but the whole claim that the Native Americans couldn't see the boats when the boats arrived. Obviously, they could see them. They probably just couldn't like figure out what the heck it was. They just saw like these nebulous blobs coming their way, and they're like, "What the heck is that?" Whereas our brain now has seen a boat close by, and when it sees it far away, it can go, "Oh, that's probably like that other thing that I saw before."
That's actually a really interesting point. I think the Japanese themselves actually experienced a similar thing. They were so isolationist, they didn't know what the fuck a boat was. They looked at it was like, what is this? They knew that it did something and that it made you float on the water. They potentially also had their own derivative version of what a boat is, but they didn't see a war boat before. They haven't seen that before. They see this as like, goddamn. Like seeing something that's fresh out of DARPA, a new type of warboat. Like imagine that. That would strike you as odd too, wouldn't it? You wouldn't know how to really figure that one out. Like you have this new stealth ship that's all weird and cornery and looks like a badly peeled potato.
Yeah, 100%. Because our brains work that way. It's like if we're walking around in a crowd and somebody says Adrian, your ears are going to pop up much faster than mine because your brain has dedicated neurons to templating that and it has a concept. So like the latent space in your brain is very different than the latent space in mine because on a scratch pad somewhere it has said listen for sounds that match the following frequency, the following heights and drops, and that might be my name.
Yeah. By the way, I posted that refinement of ideas, and I hope this will last for quite a while. I'm pretty sure at some point we may add things to this, but this is essentially what I like to do. I absorb a lot of information passively throughout the 10-hour spaces on average that we do, and then post that out as individual nuggets. That's what my timeline consists of, essentially, right? I just post random shit out there that occurs to me. So that's how I make sense of the spaces. But yeah, I mean, this is a really nice discussion. I kind of miss this. We don't have it too often, but whenever the opportunity presents itself, it's next level. I like it. I like it very much.
Hey, Metaphor, can I ask you a philosophical question?
Sure.
I know you're super technical on the technical side, but on the philosophical side, do you think we use our brain to tune in into wider plane of awareness, or we render everything just in our brain?
You asking subjectively or if I have any
Yeah,
like
subjectively.
okay. um I personally believe that I tap into another world. I can't prove that, but yeah, I would say I'm a little bit religious. Not particularly religious, but
I
a little
mean, we
bit,
know
yeah.
we can only see so much of the electromagnetic spectrum, but how much of it can we feel into with other senses? So when you talk about like,
I'd say there's a logical explanation for the universe, and this explanation exceeds our ability to parse. So essentially, this is my way of saying, don't worry about it and keep grinding.
eh,
Yeah, so
that's
so
not
Wiggle, I have
motivating.
a
Simple
It's
fucking thing.
not motivating for me, but if it works for you, that's dope. I'm glad it does.
I mean,
Wiggle, I
I
have
wouldn't
a
want to waste my shit. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I have a thought experiment that is not mine, and I would have to look up whose it is. But it's called the Android thought experiment. Have you ever heard of it?
Please do tell.
No, go ahead.
All right, first, Wiggle, we need to find somebody else who believes in some kind of like a religious soul or something along those
I
lines.
mean, I'm down. I got
I can
that.
go
I
either
got
way.
that position pretty well.
Hey, bro.
All right, cool. Sorry,
Wow.
it's gonna sound weird coming from me because I just announced my position, but
Dude,
just
alright, hold on.
pretend you didn't.
Yeah.
Show how
So I'm gonna take
stretchy
the
this
position of
stuff
somebody
is.
who claims there is no
I've
soul.
already squeezed it.
And now imagine I invent two machines. The first machine is a
This thing is
perfect
very much
atom
like a
by
rubber
atom
band.
electron, all the way down to your, quarks and
Compare it to the
nuance.
size of your hand or your
Perfect
finger.
replicator. So
You can see how
I
long it is.
point it at
Right
you,
here.
and it makes a perfect replica of you
Is
next
it
to you.
on?
Does that
Oh,
thing
there it
have
is.
a soul and the ability to tap into the other part of the systems, like you were saying?
Oh, it's such a fantastic question. I love that
Pulling
one.
it.
I think we might
This is the jugular
misunderstand
vein.
what a soul is. We keep on trying to think of things as physical objects, and they're really more like standing waveforms. And so when you talk about a soul, are you talking about the material that was cobbled together through some way or another that now seems to exhibit consciousness, or are you talking about the consciousness itself?
Hey, bro.
Because
Wow.
I'm asking
it's an
you.
important distinction. Because if you think that
Alright, hold
consciousness
on.
is more
I'm
of
not
a
sure how
field
stretchy
than
this
like
stuff is.
discrete objects, like you're a
I've
pebble and I'm a
already
pebble,
used
and we make up like a sandy beach or whatever. But like consciousness as a
Seems very
field
much like a rubber
is
band.
kind of ever present, just like the rest of the
Compare
light
it to the
spectrum
size
is.
of your hand or your finger, so
Okay, so then
how long it
whichever
is.
position you hold would, if you hold the position that it's
Oh, no, there
everywhere,
it is.
then you would claim that it is conscious and it does have a soul,
Yeah,
right?
the way I kind of think of that, and I'm just a
Going
layman,
in.
you know, so I'm just ripping, but
This is the jugular
material
vein.
reality. There's the little fun thing people say that we taught rocks how to think, like that's computers. If you organize the material and the information properly in a material fashion, you can exceed what is clearly material
Hey, bro.
into realms that are
Wow.
clearly non-material. And so
Yeah,
the way I
hold
look at
on.
it
I'm
is
not sure how
that to the
stretchy this
degree
stuff
any
is.
given thing can
I've already
contain
used
consciousness,
it.
meaning that it's organized, such that it can contain consciousness of some
It's very
kind,
much like a rubber
it might be
band.
safe to just assume it does.
Okay, so then I would say that's a distinction without a difference, right? So like, then the argument would be if I were to make an android and arrange its brain in a similar pattern, it would be alive and it would have consciousness, and so AGI would have a soul.
Yeah. I mean, but this would be the changing of several definitions that are pretty foundational to the questions you're asking, like soul, um, alive, consciousness.
I think I missed how I changed them.
No, you haven't. I'm saying that my answer is predicated on having different definitions for those words.
Okay. Yeah, generally when I ask this question, it goes slightly differently because people will usually say, no, the other android is not alive. And if you do take that position, then the second machine that's invented is the ability to take each quark and teleport it and swap it. And the question becomes, at what point does the soul transfer?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a
sorry.
soul of Theseus. You can't pull that trick.
Mm, yes.
The only out that I have is I claim you didn't take into account space. So you have the space-time continuum.
Yes, exactly.
So you could argue in a fourth dimension that is the distinction,
Oh,
but I don't have a strong position on
that's
it.
a good one. I mean, I like that just as like mechanistically, but yeah,
It's a tautology.
yeah,
It doesn't really prove
and it
anything.
feels like the version of this conversation you're trying to have is 101 level, and I'm like not quite at that level.
I'm also very tired, and I probably didn't explain it too well. I gave away my position to
No,
start, so it doesn't
you
really
did
help.
great. I'm just a pain in the ass, dude. I'm sorry.
Because normally I wouldn't tell the person my position, and then at the end it's like a
I
twist
didn't.
because they just
Yeah.
assume
Oh, well,
somebody
that's
in
fair.
science is
That's
like an
fair.
atheist.
I didn't take it much into account for my own
So
position.
essentially, okay, so to revamp this, essentially you do believe in the concept of soul, right?
Me personally, yes.
Now, here's the thing. I kind of believe in a similar thing, and I've questioned this belief quite heavily because I'm like, what if I just manufacture this as a veil of ignorance to essentially not get me to stress out about the idea that death may be oblivion? There is an interesting element to the biological aspects of neurology, right? Of course, so let's look into this more functionally. I keep bringing this up multiple times because I think it has such a big impact. I know about this neurologist who I've interviewed before once. He told me something really interesting. His name is Burton Tabak. You may want to look him up at some point. But he told me that essentially the theory goes that the brain is like a receiver, right? And that how it works is you tune into essentially one radio station, and that is consciousness, right? What you can also do, however, is you can access more of that. Imagine a radio being able to access not only just one station, but access all stations at the same time, even ones that are secret channels. And that's what, say, compounds such as DMT or psilocybin facilitate. This is all what allows you to perceive this weird stuff. You're not actually seeing anything, right? You're perceiving additional stuff that doesn't make any sense initially, right? And so I think that essentially what the soul could be is just information, but it's information that is scraped from normal, definable reality, and then written upon the cosmic tapestry as if it were our brains were a typewriter. And I think that's the soul. It's our connection to this weird cosmic tapestry. That's how I think of it. I think it's not separate at all. It's all just one thing,
Mm-hmm.
but individual things tap into it and thereby ride upon it. What do you think of that?
So this is one of those like I I love that idea and I used to hold that idea for a while and then like ignorance is bliss kind of situation. So I can describe to you how the human mind works on this front if you want to know. And if you would prefer,
Yes,
I
go
can
ahead.
opt out. Okay. All right. There's a
No,
great
tell me.
book by Jonah Lear called Imagine, which goes into great detail on this stuff. And it's basically it's like the Malcolm Gladwell equivalent of like, somebody's not necessarily expert in the space, but does a good job
Mm-hmm.
of coagulating a whole bunch of stuff. But they talked to a whole bunch of people who've done research on different drug effects on the brain, et cetera. And one of the interesting things about scans, and I'm going to hand wave here. Don't go into my background and use that as like this is like fact. This is needs to be double checked. But like the argument that holds pretty strong in my mind is that the left hemisphere in our mind actually is responsible for almost everything we think of as consciousness, right? Whether it's language, math, creativity, like, I know you hear a lot of times like, oh, math is on the left and creativity is on the right. That's not exactly correct. Almost everything you think of is on the left in its structured form. And then arguably what's on the right is kind of like your subconscious, which doesn't really speak, but it sparks, and we do see in scans, it's firing a lot when people are like meditating or trying to like tune inwards or like come up with creative problem solving and things like that. So the idea is like if we look at neural nets now, we're trying to ground it. What if the input and output layers, and then those neurons that are close to the input and output layers, and that represent the consciousness, are all in the left hemisphere, and then there's a choke point and a sync point, which is why the interconnectivity is much lower. And then on the other side is a whole bunch of neurons with a crazy latent space that we are intentionally designed to not really understand. And so those fire in random ways. And those are the ones where that's basically the sex chamber for ideas, if you will.
Interesting. I like
I
that.
like that too.
It also gives a hint as to like the mixture of experts argument. If you think about it, like if you look at our brain, there's a whole bunch of forced sync points, but the sync points are not well defined. They're just defined in terms of, say, vector size. And so it forces some kind of structure to be formed, and then from there to only reason about the structure that was formed, which is pretty cool. And when you think of like MOE, that's kind of like what it's doing.
Oh, yeah.
Which is unfortunate because
Interesting.
FSD is going the opposite direction, right? So right now with V12, they're going end
Exactly,
to end,
yeah.
fully latent connection. And I thought with 11, they were going to do just perception, then planning and controls, and force a sync point. And the sync point for a while was human readable language, your descriptor, which is not ideal, but you could have theoretically allowed it to also write out a scratch pad and then just have the scratch pad be exchanged from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, or the perception to the planner. Anyway, this
At this
for
moment of the
anybody who
scratch pad,
follows
of
me,
course.
and wonders why I really probably got the whole September end of September thing wrong. That was kind of like the direction I thought they were going to go. Obviously, I don't know if I would have
So
been right.
you, yeah. So the what you just explained with the scratch pad, this is also the same way that you think Sora operates, correct? Because you mentioned this before.
Right, right. The scratch pad, think of it like there is a scratch pad between hemispheres, but there's also a scratch pad within the hemisphere that it's passing back to itself. And another way you can think of this as short-term memory is what we would call inner consciousness, but there's a whole bunch of other short-term scratch pads all over the
Cool.
place.
That's
Nice.
really cool.
So as Scoble's screaming about the voxels, everything's a voxel, every voxel talks to you now, accurate?
Fuck, was Scoble right?
Well, he's talking about the
He's talking
world.
about LLMs under there, yeah.
God damn
Yeah,
it.
he's talking about the world in terms of perception basis. Um, uh, th- I don't have a strong opinion on this, but you can argue, like maybe from a Descartesian perspective, that's true, right? I
Yeah.
think therefore I am. Everything else doesn't exist. I only exist. So everything is actually just a voxel, and I'm in a simulation. And so if you like Descartes' argument is basically the simulation theory, right? Like everybody else doesn't exist, and I'm just
Rude.
in a simulation.
Life,
I think we all
Right here,
exist, and it's
bro.
all just a simulation. Like, what makes you different from it? I think we're just the simulation. All of us are. This is why I say, if you want to break the simulation, you're not going to break shit. You're just going to break yourself. You technically have broken the simulation because you've opted out of the simulation as an individual. And technically speaking, because you are simulated, you are the simulative aspect that is opted out of being simulated, right?
How detailed into philosophy do we want to get?
I don't know, man. As deep as you want to go. I don't
All right.
care.
There's a personal
And
theory.
I'm not pressure sensitive.
All right. This is a personal theory. Feel free to rip it apart. But
Oh god.
okay, I would argue one way to look at it is, okay, clearly the Descartesian perspective is single player, is multiplayer. And while we invented a lot of like combative multiplayer games, that's one way to get a whole bunch of emotions. Like if we talk about art, right? So there's the derivative
I like
art
where you're
or
going
the
with this.
easier arts that are like, okay. You like where I'm
Yeah,
going?
keep going.
So you have all these like combative games, right? And then it takes like an evolved higher level to eventually get to like cooperative games. What if the simulation's actually a cooperative
Mm.
game and we're actually supposed to exit the finish line at the same time?
Thank you, Metaphor. It's really nice to meet you. I'm Kirk. Hi.
Did you take acid or something?
No, I'm just really
Me?
excited to
No.
hear somebody else.
Him.
I'm just really excited to hear somebody else say some shit like that in a text space.
Yeah.
Uncommon.
I think it's interesting because Descartes' whole view of the world is actually kind of interesting. Like it is actually, I think, more of an illustration of bias, right? Because you think you're at the center of the universe. Everything thinks it's the center of the universe. It's also why we think that one part of the planet is the top and the other is the bottom. Well, in reality, it makes no sense whatsoever to say that the map should be oriented this way around as opposed to the other way around. It doesn't
Yeah,
make
it's
any
actually
sense
pretty
whatsoever.
funny. There's a lake in, I think, Ontario, Canada, where upper is south and lower is north. And it's because the person who named it forgot that the north side of the magnet points
But
south.
So your upper is your lower and your lower is your upper.
Yeah, like it's just, and it's like one of those funny
Wow.
things where it's like somebody just made a mistake and they just stuck to it. It's just one of those. It doesn't
That
really
is
matter because
absolutely
globes didn't
crazy.
exist at the time, I'm guessing, right? They didn't really have a
Oh
standardized thing.
shit. That is actually funny. Yeah, I like that.
yeah, every point
Something.
every point on circumference of a sphere is a center. So yeah, in a way that like that's how.
You're always
Yeah.
self-centric.
One
You
one of my
can't fucking
favorite
help yourself.
one of my favorite art pieces in my home, by the way, is I have two things. I have like a map that's like broken into five pieces, and I have a globe, and they're both upside down. And a lot of times people look at it and they get very confused. But if you're Australian, that should probably be exactly how things look.
Yeah.
So following your projection that there is an outcome, same outcome for everyone, would that mean that consciousness is fundamental and it just like abstracts the truth for us to navigate in?
I would argue that consciousness is not a real thing, and it is a byproduct just as much as, say, a river going down and seeking the lowest point. It's not that the river is deciding where to go. It's operating on uh, a set of rules. But if you were to look at any like fish or whatever in the river, it may think that the river has chosen different directions, right? Like it may assign it might anthropomorphize. I always struggle with that word. Anthropomorphize the river.
Anthropomorphize, yeah.
Anthropomorphize. I don't know why I always struggle with that word. My neurons have messed it up for me. But I think it's a side effect. It's like, is the color green perceived by all of us the same? Probably
Dude,
not.
nice.
Is consciousness
Oh,
perceived by all of us the same? Maybe not.
yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a thing. I mean, again, I kind of want to go back to the idea of it being some sort of storage point, because if you want to look at DNA, it actually functionally DNA doesn't make any sense in the way that it's being executed upon. So imagine that all the data is there. Let's agree upon that. We can all agree that that's where data is stored. But now imagine that somehow a singular cell that contains the same data, same DNA, same everything, somehow has to attach itself to another cell, and then that mountain of cells is assembled to essentially be you. How the fuck does a cell know how to be arranged? How does anything know how to make other cells that make other things, like say organs, as opposed to just skin cells? How the fuck does that work if it's all the same DNA? And so
It's not.
I would argue that basically it's like cloud storage, right?
No, it's
Or
not
am I
though.
getting something wrong?
You made a premise error here. So you have DNA,
Okay.
you have mRNA, and you have a protein gnome. It's your protein gnome that doesn't split evenly.
Right, right. But how does it carry on a message of one cell being different from the other over such great distances
Let's say your DNA. This is
and the
not necessarily how it
variations?
works. This is not how it works. We're going to hand wave here, but we're going to use a
Cool, cool.
simplified analogy here. Let's say there
Yes,
are
please.
only 4 specializations in the human cell system, right? So it's like you got red, blue, green, yellow. Those are the only types of cells. You start with stem cells, and your DNA says, okay, when the first injection occurs and you start forming the bond of the sperm and the egg, at that point construct 60 yellow proteins, 40 red proteins, so many blue and so many green, whatever, right? And then every single time the cells split, they basically have like an election, and they go, oh, one of those proteins is going to attach, and it's random based on how many of them there are. It's going to attach to a specific part of the DNA strand, and whichever one picks up the blueprint, it's going to read it its way, and it's going to make this cell specialize that way. And you could say the initial stages of the stem cell, the proteins don't like act until like a certain number of divisions have happened, and that's just a function of how long it takes for them to activate in terms of time. Or it might be that they have a counter and that each of them keeps count, and at the moment that that count is reached, then they start specializing. But you can see how like these kinds of all these distributed algorithms that I described are all feasible ways you could accomplish this.
Okay, true, true, yeah.
Think of it as like
So
a
again, it's like the
fractal.
river. The river didn't decide. The cells didn't decide. They were all just keeping count, and the dance of the rules made them do what they were supposed to do.
Yeah,
Gotcha,
a,
man. Thanks
a,
for
a
settling that
fractal is
one.
extremely complex, but it starts with a very simple formula, and you just keep on playing it out, and you end up getting a pattern from it. Sort of the same idea.
Yeah.
Makes
Don't
sense,
go into a
yeah.
biology class and tell them this. This is a very, very, very crude simplification.
Yes, yes, yes. Although I should probably read more biology. Yeah. Something, since you obviously delve into that, I have no idea what you do for real life now. You've accrued all this information. I bet, quite many people get asked the same thing about me. But with your mind, when you look at X and how everything functions, how do you visualize it? I visualize it as a 3D vector space in a network where the weights of that network are altered in specific areas, which then determines where exactly your posts are distributed to and what value is associated with it by the weights that are modified by the users in various parts of the network, right? That's how I visualize it. How do you visualize it?
I haven't really, I'll be honest. But now that you ask, uh, it probably is a non-relational database, basically, and they have a whole bunch of virtual trees mapped on top of it. So each user has its own tree signature of what are the next closest nodes it cares about. And then for each of those closest nodes, those nodes have some information like the people you follow, the people it thinks you like you interact with regularly. They all get added to different lists. Some you've actively created, some they create for you behind the scenes. Then each of those lists, you have derivative secondary effects. So, it goes to basically a tree search at some point and says, okay, I'm going to generate the news feed. It says, give me all the top posts. And then it does like effectively a map reduce across all these nodes. They all go make their own lists. They score it, they weigh it, it comes back up. And then you resolve and then you rank and sort everything onto the news feed. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking. I like that.
So
That is a
Yeah, it makes
first
sense.
draft. That is a first draft implementation.
do you see other
It's
modules?
fucking nice.
Do you see other modules being open sourced in the future?
Oh, in addition to the algorithm, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it much. I'm not gonna lie. My brain has been very occupied lately.
Because I've been trying to rip apart how things work and basically come to that exact same conclusion, just from a different perspective. Which also kind of means that no matter how hard you try, even if you try to manipulate the system, eventually it fights back because you're fighting against the way it's constructed, right? This is why engagement
Ah,
farms are inherently stupid.
right. So I've thought about this before. So, um, I know we've talked about how I hate crypto in the past. Like you knew
Fair.
this. I'm not gonna have a strong opinion on it,
Fair.
but I came to that conclusion after thinking about it a lot. So when I reference it here, understand that I have thought about that space. Um, in social graphs, there are different ways that you can make things defensive. And I'm just going to lean on the crypto stuff just because it's easy, it's more popular and known. But this is basically CAPS theorem. Um, capacity, I can't remember it all now, but there's something called CAPS theorem. People can look it up. Partitioning, accuracy, and consistency. There we go, got there. Um, you have trade-offs. There's always a trilemma. And one of the trade-offs is how fast you get things out there. That's a notion of consistency. Latency, another way you can think of it with crypto. The other one is like how accurate the information is going to be. So when you query one part of the graph in another part of the graph, in a banking graph, you need to make sure everything's consistent everywhere. Or sorry, it's actually accurate. And then the last one is partitioning, where if the graph breaks apart, how do you deal with it? And security is one of those other things. And what you can do in these graphs is you can basically say, how many other nodes influence my computation? So in the world of social networks, we don't need a consistent experience. So you can actually dial down consistency a lot. You need to keep accuracy high because you don't want people to see posts from people they don't actually follow or people they don't actually like and stuff like that. And partitioning isn't really a big factor either because if there's a partition in the graph and you don't see certain posts because you can't reach them, it's not the end of the world. So we can throw the partition away. So the nice part here is all you have to do is focus on accuracy, which makes you uh, it makes it very secure because I select the people that I follow. There's a small inference of who those people then follow. So if you only limited the news feed to people you follow and the people they follow, or you put a really, really heavy weight on that, let's say 90% of the content in the newsfeed must come from them, then it's very difficult for you to hack data into people's news feeds. If you lean more heavily on inferred algorithms, like somebody interacted with something or they engaged with something, then you could do engagement farming to hack those particular whatever percentage of the newsfeed is allowed to be that.
Yeah, but doesn't that self-correct?
It will because people will theoretically engage less with the stuff as soon as it starts becoming a thing that they're being targeted on. However, it depends on how it's implemented. So if you have a global, this is what's popular to everybody, and you blend that into everybody's newsfeed, theoretically that could be susceptible. If you have a per individual, this is what they care about, that's probably a little bit harder to hack, but also harder to rectify. So it tends to go in that direction. The more global you are, the easier it is to hack, and the easier it is to fix. The more personalized you are, the harder it is to hack, but but it's also harder to
That makes
fix.
sense.
Yeah,
But
I
you
like
kind of
that
want it
because
to be the latter anyway, because then a handful of users are like, "This is a shitty experience," and they leave, and everybody else is like, "This is great."
Exactly. I mean, this is kind of how I see the X algorithm to function, right? I think a few people don't exactly get it, and they try to manipulate it to try and get something out of it. And this is something that I aim to combat. Like, I see these weird posts about everyone saying, "Oh, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do that." I'm like, how about we discard all of this because we're just trying to fix existing problems with duct tape? Why don't we just ask ourselves how exactly these problems occur? Well, these problems occur as a byproduct of misusing the system. So how can we use the system better to prevent these things from happening that we're trying to fix with duct tape, right? If you shoot into the side of a boat a bunch of holes and you try to fix those